In 1872, a man named George Smith stood in a room at the British Museum, holding a small piece of broken clay covered in wedge-shaped marks. He had taught himself to read a language that had been dead for 2,000 years. And as he worked through the lines on that fragment, he read a story he already knew by heart. A god, angry at humanity. A warning given to one righteous man. An enormous boat. A great flood that drowns the world. A bird sent out to find dry land. A mountain where the vessel finally comes to rest. It was the story of Noah's Arkansas. Except this tablet was carved more than 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was written. Smith was so overwhelmed that, according to the account, he began tearing off his clothes in excitement. He had found something that would haunt scholars for the next century and a half. Because it raised a question that a lot of people did not want to ask. What if the story of Noah did not begin with Noah? And what if a real event, a genuine catastrophe, lies buried underneath all of it? The flood before the flood. To understand the mystery, you have to start with how strange the flood story is in the first place. It is not unique to the Bible. Versions of a great deluge appear across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Greece to India to the Americas. For centuries, people took this as evidence that a single, global flood really happened, exactly as Genesis describes, and that every culture simply remembered the same event. But there is a problem with that reading. A literal, worldwide flood, covering every mountain on Earth, is flatly contradicted by geology. There is no layer of sediment marking a single global inundation. There is not enough water on or in the planet to do it. And the different flood myths, when you actually compare them, are not describing the same event. They disagree on almost everything except the water. So the global flood explanation collapses. But that leaves a much more interesting question standing. Why do so many cultures, especially in one particular part of the world, tell such similar stories? And where did the oldest version actually come from? The tablet George Smith found was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, generally considered the oldest surviving great work of literature in human history. On its 11th tablet, a character named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived a flood sent by the gods. The parallels to Noah are not vague. They are specific, and they are startling. The gods decide to destroy humanity. One man is chosen and warned in advance. He is told to build a great boat and seal it with pitch, inside and out, the same material described in Genesis. He takes his family and living creatures aboard. The flood comes and destroys everything. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. And then, to test whether the waters have receded, he releases birds, one after another, until one does not return. A dove, in the biblical version. In the older Mesopotamian one, a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. When Smith published this in the 1870s, it caused a sensation, and no small amount of anxiety. Here was one of the most sacred narratives in the Bible, appearing almost beat for beat in a pagan poem written centuries earlier by people who worshipped an entirely different set of gods. And it goes back further still. Scholars eventually realized that the Gilgamesh flood story was itself not the original. It had been adapted from an even older Mesopotamian poem, known as the Epic of Atrahasis, parts of which survive on tablets dating to around the 17th century before Christ. In the Atrahasis version, the flood hero has a different name, but the shape is the same. And the reason for the flood is revealing. In these older Mesopotamian stories, the gods do not send the flood because humanity has become wicked. They send it because humanity has become too numerous and too loud. The noise of the growing human population annoys the gods, who decide to wipe the slate clean. That detail matters, because it shows the story evolving. By the time it reaches Genesis, the motive has been rewritten. The flood is no longer about noise and overcrowding. It is about human wickedness and divine justice, a moral transformation that fits the theology of the people telling it. This is the pattern scholars now widely accept. The biblical flood story did not appear from nowhere. It is the surviving heir of a much older Mesopotamian tradition, most likely encountered directly by Jewish scribes during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ, when the elite of Jerusalem were deported to Babylon and lived for decades among its temples, libraries, and cuneiform archives. The story was not invented. It was inherited. But that only deepens the real mystery. Because a story this widespread, this persistent, and this old usually has something underneath it. Myths are not created from nothing. So the question becomes, was there a real flood, a specific catastrophe, terrible enough to burn itself into human memory and echo down thousands of years? In 1997, two respected marine geologists thought they had found it. William Ryan and Walter Pittman, working at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, had spent years studying the floor of the Black Sea. And they proposed something dramatic. At the end of the last ice age, they argued, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, cut off from the rising oceans of the world, its surface sitting far below sea level. A natural dam, or the Bosporus is today, held back the Mediterranean. As the glaciers melted, global sea levels climbed higher and higher, until the Mediterranean rose above that barrier. And then, around 7,600 years ago, the dam broke. Salt water came roaring through the Bosporus with, by one estimate, the force of 200 Niagara Falls. The lake began to rise, they claimed, by as much as 15 centimeters a day. The shoreline advanced across the flat northern plains at a kilometer or more per day, faster than a person could comfortably move a settlement. By the time it was over, water levels had risen scores of meters, and an area of dry, inhabited land the size of a small country had vanished beneath the waves. It was a spectacular theory, and Ryan and Pittman took the final step that made it famous. In a best-selling 1998 book, they suggested that this was the flood. The catastrophe behind the myths. The event that drove refugees outward across the ancient world, carrying with them the memory of a day the sea swallowed everything, a memory that eventually became Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, and Noah. The idea was irresistible. It had science, scripture, and catastrophe all in one package. Robert Ballard, the man who found the wreck of the Titanic, launched expeditions into the Black Sea searching for drowned Neolithic settlements. Documentaries were made. The theory entered popular culture as established fact. And then the other scientists went to check. This is the part the documentaries rarely follow up on. Because when researchers examined the Black Sea flood hypothesis in detail over the following years, it did not hold up cleanly. In fact, large parts of it began to come apart. The objections came from several directions at once. First, the direction of the water. Ryan and Pittman's scenario required the Mediterranean to pour north into the Black Sea. But detailed studies of the Marmara Sea Gateway, the channel connecting the two, found evidence that from the earliest times, the dominant flow had been the other way, southward, out of the Black Sea. That is the opposite of what the catastrophe required. Second, the scale. In 2009, a team led by Levi Ujayasan at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution reconstructed the ancient water levels and reached a very different conclusion. The flood, if it happened at all, was far smaller than Ryan and Pittman claimed. Instead of a rise of 50 or 60 meters, they found evidence for something more like 5 to 10. Instead of drowning an area the size of a small nation, the water would have covered a fraction of that, a region roughly half the size of the smallest American state. That is not nothing. A rising lake that swallows 2,000 square kilometers of land is a real disaster for the people living there. But it is not the biblical apocalypse. It is not a wall of water advancing across the horizon. The scientific community today is genuinely divided. Some researchers still defend a significant, rapid Black Sea flood. Others argue it was slow, modest, and unremarkable. The evidence is contested, and the honest position is that we do not yet have a settled answer. So where does that leave us? With something more subtle, and in a way more interesting, than a single lost catastrophe. Step back and look at the timing. The flood myths of the Near East cluster in a specific window of human history, the thousands of years following the end of the last ice age. And that period was defined by water. As the great ice sheets melted, sea levels around the entire planet rose by roughly 120 meters. This did not happen gently or evenly. It came in surges. Coastlines that families had lived on for generations disappeared. The Persian Gulf, which had been a green and habitable valley, flooded and became a sea. Land bridges vanished. islands were cut off. Across the inhabited world, people watched the water come, and did not leave. There was not one flood. There were many. And the people of Mesopotamia, living on a low, flat plain between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were especially vulnerable. That plain flooded catastrophically and repeatedly. Archaeologists digging at ancient Mesopotamian cities have found thick layers of river silt, evidence of individual floods so severe they buried entire settlements. For them, it was the end of the world. This is the resolution the evidence actually points to, and it is worth sitting with, because it is stranger than the myth. The flood story is not the record of one specific day. It is the compressed memory of an entire age of rising water, an age our ancestors lived through, distilled over thousands of years of retelling into a single, unforgettable narrative. A dozen real catastrophes, remembered as one. The Mesopotamians, watching their rivers destroy their cities, gave that memory its first written form. They shaped it into Atrahasis, then Gilgamesh. Centuries later, exiled Jewish scribes in Babylon encountered that ancient story, and reworked it into something new, giving it a moral center and a single god, until it became the Noah we know. And underneath the whole chain, there is a real historical truth. Our ancestors genuinely did live through a time when the seas rose and swallowed the land. They genuinely did watch the water take everything. They remembered it the only way humans can, as a story. So did the flood of Noah happen? The honest answer is both no and yes. No, there was no single, global deluge that covered the mountains and destroyed all life, and the specific Black Sea catastrophe that was supposed to explain it is now seriously doubted. But yes, something real is buried under the myth. Not one flood, but an age of them. A world that our ancestors watched drown, coastline by coastline, over thousands of years, at the end of the Ice Age. George Smith, tearing at his clothes in the British Museum, had stumbled onto the beginning of that thread. He thought he had found confirmation of the Bible. What he had actually found was something deeper and older, the moment a real human catastrophe first became a story, long before anyone thought to call the hero Noah. The water was real. The fear was real. And the memory has outlived every civilization that ever tried to tell it. The memory outlived every civilization that told it. Subscribe if you want to keep following the questions that don't have clean answers. See you in the dark.